On Sunday, President Joe Biden announced that he would be stepping out of the presidential race, and he endorsed his Vice President Kamala Harris for the candidacy for the Democratic Party. Here to explain the historic nature of this moment is Kelly Dittmar. She is the Director of Research at Rutgers University's Center for American Women in Politics. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start just by asking, what is your reaction to the last 24 hours? It's been quite a news stretch.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been all in the whirlwind of process for a lot of this, like what's going to happen, what are the moves that people are going to make, how ultimately is somebody going to become the nominee, and those are all really important things. But I have been trying to take a step back and say, like, this is really going to be and likely will be historic, even just the nomination, right? And we know that Kamala Harris doesn't have the nomination yet, but were she to earn the Democratic nomination, she'll be just the second woman to ever be a major party nominee for president. She'll be the first Black woman, the first South Asian woman, first multiracial woman to be a major party presidential nominee. So I think we do need to take a breath and note that as a historical milestone. And then obviously if she goes on to be successful, we could be electing the first woman president of the United States. So kind of the big picture reflection is, wow, we've really shifted in the last 24 hours on the degree to which we could make history in this election, pretty significantly. But at the same point, obviously, there's a lot of steps to get there. And so then, certainly have been digging down in the weeds of what would this look like to both get to the nomination and ultimately to see if she could be successful in November.
Now, you referenced the historic nature of what could be her nomination. Of course, she is not officially the nominee for the party yet. That is still to be determined, though, as we'll talk about, a lot of people have thrown their endorsement behind her. But since we're taking a step back, what do you think regular voters should know about Kamala Harris that they might not be aware of if they haven't really been paying attention to her up until now?
Yeah, I mean, I think she has a history of trailblazing. So we go from her, being elected statewide in California as an attorney general. She went on to be elected to the U.S. Senate, the first Black woman to be elected from the U.S. Senate to the U.S. Senate, from California, and only the second Black woman to serve in the U.S. Senate. I mean, this is a place where we really have had dismal representation, both in statewide executive offices for Black women as well as in the U.S. Senate. And so in both of those places, she's navigated being either a first and an only or first or an only. And so she knows what this path looks like. And of course, she obviously then went on to become the first woman vice president. And so this is something she's accustomed to. So in this case, being the second woman to be a nominee, the first Black woman to potentially be a major party presidential nominee, this will not be new to her. And then I would just add in terms of her trajectory, obviously she was very successful in the Senate. I think got a lot more national attention because of the way she brought her prosecutorial skills to many of those Senate committee hearings. We know prominently, in the confirmation hearings for Justice Kavanaugh, her really putting him on the spot in a way that he was obviously uncomfortable, but really got to some answers around reproductive rights. But there are many examples like that. And I think we'll see them rotated again as she campaigns. And then as vice president, just to acknowledge, obviously, she ran for president herself, was unsuccessful, had to drop out of that campaign relatively early. She didn't compete in primaries. Talked about the financial challenge, which I think is tied to electability bias, which we could talk more about, folks thinking it wasn't possible that she could beat Donald Trump. I think that has shifted immensely over 4 years. And I want to credit the fact that she's been second in command for that time period. And I think that helps her to make the case that she is absolutely electable in 2024.
Let's talk about her record as vice president. She's been prominent on the issue of reproductive health. I think she's kind of been the singular figure from the administration, kind of going out around the country talking about the importance of reproductive health laws. But what's your take in terms of her policy achievements and what she has achieved as second in command?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. She's been held to a very different standard than previous vice presidents. I think going in, because she was this trailblazing figure, folks really wanted to see more of her and hear more about the specific policy achievements she made. But as most vice presidents do, she has been, a soldier for the administration, right? Like in a good way. She's fighting for key administration policy proposals. She's been on the forefront on some of the toughest ones: voting rights, immigration, abortion rights, right? And so the administration has put a lot of trust in her to be both publicly speaking on these issues, as well as internally, obviously, influencing messaging and direction of the administration on them. So I think we can speak to the fact that she's been influential. She's also been a good voice on a lot of these major issues that people care about. And so she'll be able to shift that into her presidential campaign, saying, like, look, I've been in the room and I've been out on in the country to both learn about and speak on these issues and advocate for them. In terms of the different standards, the only other thing I want to raise there is, so folks talk about, oh, well, she has low favorability. First of all, her favorability is not that different than other vice presidents. It's also not very different than Joe Biden, right? Folks, the favorability people give often is to the administration, and that's no surprise. Also important is that for the last 4 years, the Trump campaign and then the Republican Party have targeted Kamala Harris as the face of the administration. And they have done so purposefully, right? Because her race and her gender make her more prone to attacks that she is radical or extreme or dangerous. Those are all racialized tropes. And so they put her as the face and said she's really in charge. The interesting thing about her becoming potentially the nominee is that then it actually doesn't change the strategy much, and she's already been encountering these attacks. And so her campaign should be ready for them. And I think already has been, obviously pushing back by pointing to all the things she's done.
Now, when you talk about the issues that she has campaigned on as second in command, what do you think her policy platform should be as she campaigns to be first in command? I referenced reproductive rights and women's issues. She talks about being a stepmom. She has talked about the caregiving crisis in America. Does that help her? Or if, as speculation suggests, and she recruits a white man as her second in command, should he talk about the women's issues, and should she focus on the economy and immigration and global relationships?
Yeah, I mean, look, on the one hand, absolutely, just because she's a woman, just because she's a Black person and South Asian person, doesn't mean she has to speak only to those communities' primary issues or issues of primary concern to those communities. However, the difference, I would say, is not about kind of should she change the policy platform. She probably won't. I mean, you would guess, with a very short on-ramp and her being a part of this administration, she's not going to run away from the policy issues that were already central to the Biden-Harris campaign, which, by the way, abortion was at the top of the list, right? They knew and have banked on this being a mobilizing issue, and you heard not only her, but Joe Biden speak about that issue. Whoever she chooses as the running mate is also going to talk about that issue, whether they're male or female. But I also think that there is a value of having women who have direct lived experiences navigating reproductive health, right? Navigating issues of caregiving, perhaps to a different degree or in a different way, or at least to a different set of expectations than their male counterparts. For her, living at the intersection of race and gender, right? Understanding what it's like to navigate power systems as a Black woman. That's the part of her messaging and platform that I don't think changes the issues, but it changes how they are talked about and the extent to which they might resonate differently when she talks about them with different communities of voters. So I think it's more, to me, that the issues that she talks about don't necessarily change drastically. Obviously, she's going to have her own preferences now as the top of the ticket, but it's the how she talks about them and the ways in which they can then resonate.
Now, we talked about the historic nature of her whole career, basically. She has been the first and the only, as you have said, in a number of offices. And I want to ask you, Kelly, because you look at women in politics, does it help when candidates focus on any historic nature of their candidacy, or would it be better for her to not focus on how exceptional that is and instead focus on her prosecutorial career or her South Asian identity or some other aspect of who she is as a person and politician?
Yeah, I think we know that simply saying, elect me because I can make history, which, by the way, women rarely do. But they've been, they're kind of attacked for that. Like, oh, you're just asking people to vote for me or vote for you because you're a woman or because you're going to make history. We know that actually largely isn't an effective message with most voters, because voters are smart and they want to elect somebody on issues. They want to elect somebody that shares their maybe lived experiences or their priorities. And so that's where the line, I think, is a little blurred, right? So she can absolutely leverage her lived experience and distinct perspective, both race, gender, as well as her political background and experience, her parents, their stories. She can leverage all of that to say, I understand certain issues, or I will fight for these issues, maybe in a different way than a white male candidate would have. I think you'll see that. And we have already seen that from her. We saw it when she ran for president the first time. We saw it on the trail as vice president, as well as in her time of office, being willing to say, if you remember in the debate, I was that Black girl being bussed, right? Mm-hmm. So there is a direct authenticity to her voice that she will bring and can leverage to her advantage. But that is different than saying, because I'm going to make history, vote for me. The folks who will do that, there will be people who leverage that argument, and those are going to be advocates and organizations, and even maybe some in her campaign that make the t-shirts or the memes or whatever. And that will mobilize a small group, and it will energize some folks to maybe get involved and share that enthusiasm and hope for the campaign, because I don't want to discount the importance symbolically of it. But I think she will focus more on what it actually means in terms of the merits of who she is and how that will affect the agenda she brings forth, the voices that get raised in her administration, and ultimately the impact she can have.
Now, you mentioned the electability concerns that struck her 4 years ago. And obviously, a lot has changed in 4 years. We have emerged from a global pandemic. She has been second in command. But I've already heard some concerns from certain corners of the internet and of society saying, a woman ran against Trump in 2016 and look at how that turned out. How are you looking at, I know it's only been 24 hours, but how are you looking at how people are talking about Vice President Harris now that she is the presumptive nominee?
Yeah, inevitably, as we've already seen, questions raised immediately are, can she win? Now, we would ask that of any candidate, right? Especially in this crazy circumstance. Can she win with just a few months? Can she win in bringing the Democratic Party together? Like, those are real legitimate questions. But I think what we have to be really cognitive about is that the idea that she can't win because she's a woman or because she's a Black woman is just perpetuating this bias, right? So if you say that somebody who hasn't done it before, right, who's somebody who represents a community that hasn't yet been in the office, can never win the office, right, we never make history. And so when Kamala Harris, for now many years, has that line in her stump speech about being unburdened by what has been, I always get it wrong, but, to see what is possible. That is her directly trying to take on the electability biases. She, would say things on the campaign trail like, I'm going to address the elephant in the room. And effectively, and I'm paraphrasing, she would say, you don't think I'm electable, but here's why I am. And so what I think we'll see in the coming days, and we've already seen from her surrogates and folks endorsing her, are reinforcements. She is qualified. She has the support. There is no reason that she can't win this race. And that is something that is more important, that effort and that reassurance has historically been and will be in this race more important for a woman, and in this case, a woman of color, because there are these perceptions among the electorate that oh, I'm not sure the country is ready. And when people buy into that electability bias, they reinforce it through a number of ways. One, they start to say, like, I guess I'll put my money behind somebody else. Or they say, you know what, she has no chance, so maybe I won't go out and knock those doors. And so really taking that head on right now and using the fundraising numbers and the mobilizing numbers and the number of endorsements that we're seeing from prominent Democrats, using that to say, like, oh, she's clearly electable. Hopefully, I think for her campaign, they're hoping that that will push back against some of those biases early so that she doesn't have to spend so much time, I mean that as her campaign, fighting those biases going forward.
You talk about the endorsement and the fundraising. The nonprofit fundraising site Act Blue said last night that as of 9 p.m., nearly $50 million had been raised by grassroots supporters that day. It was the largest fundraising day of the 2024 election cycle so far. Kelly, can you put into context? I mean, this is an historic moment. And so some of these numbers are naturally going to sound very big, but what do you think of it all? Can you contextualize this for us?
Yeah, no, and I wouldn't downplay it. I mean, I think this is real. It looks like she's on track to maybe be the highest, 24 hours on Act Blue in history. So not only just in this campaign, as we're not even through 24 hours, I think at this point. I think that is hugely notable. And what fundraising is, right, in the sense of, yes, her campaign needs the resources because we all live in a system where money is very influential in political contests. But money is also not just for buying campaign ads and funding your campaign staff. Fundraising metrics also are indicators of support. And so especially in this 24 hours, her being able to generate not only high dollars, but also high numbers of donors. So these are a lot of small donors. When you invest in a campaign financially, you are much more likely to show up on election day. Even if you gave $25, that you have invested enough, you took the time, you're enthusiastic enough that you also probably will make the effort to mail in that ballot or show up on election day. You might even be more willing to volunteer in other ways on the campaign. So part of what this fundraising, I think, why it's even more important than the actual dollar amount, is it's showing that support for Kamala is not at all wavering. I think there were some, certainly within the Democratic Party, who felt like, oh, there's no way she wins over either the Biden stalwarts or, the more progressive wing of the party. Well, she's winning over a lot of people in a short amount of time. And so I think it is a rebuttal from the campaign through those metrics, at least to start with.
When you talk about the number of people that the fundraising indicates, I want to ask you, I know it's so early still. We keep saying we're less than 24 hours into this news, but do you have any predictions for what this means for the down ballot races across the country?
Look, I mean, at the basic level, enthusiasm for the top of the ticket helps down ballot. Again, because what was the real concern, and I think it's still a concern, by the way. Problems have not evaporated for Democrats overnight. Democratic concern is really this cycle about turnout. Will Democrats turn out? And this is across different communities, progressives, young people, voters of color, right? Will they come out to support the Democrats because they are so essential to the outcome of the race? And so that enthusiasm and turnout at the top of the ticket is going to generate turnout and enthusiasm for down ballot races. So if people weren't going to come out for Biden, those folks in vulnerable down ballot races, as we saw, were very concerned because folks just know less about those races. They may be less enthusiastic just simply because they don't know enough. They don't realize it's a vulnerable race that gets less media attention, especially in this media environment. So absolutely, these first indicators, if you're somebody in a vulnerable congressional race or even state legislative race and you're a Democrat, you're feeling at least better in this last 24 hours. Obviously, there's a lot to come and there'll be much greater scrutiny of Kamala if she becomes the nominee, and all of that could equally hurt. But I think for now, you're feeling better than you were last week.
think we have 106 days to go, and I think we will feel every one of them. But when you talk about the populations that have to be engaged, you mentioned young people, and I know Gen Z and their enthusiasm for these candidates on both parties has been a concern, because up until 24 hours ago, you had upper 70s, lower 80s ages for these candidates.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what we've seen out of Gen Z? And I'll tee this up for you. We had the singer Charlie XCX tweeting, "Kamala is brat," in a reference to Brat Summer, and Gen Z Twitter seemed to explode as a result. So what's your take on millennials and Gen Z who are now perhaps coalescing around Kamala Harris?
Yeah, this had absolutely generationally been, if you looked at any polls, the lack of enthusiasm, the folks saying, like, I just might not turn out at all, right? There was a real concern amongst younger generations because they were looking at these two old men. They didn't feel any connection with them. And then on the issues, right, there were concerns about Joe Biden and was he progressive enough? Obviously, the issue of Israel and Palestine, right, is a big issue. That will continue to be an issue for Kamala Harris. That does not go away, especially with these young generations. But I think anytime you can see a kind of engagement with the more pop culture aspect of this generation, as you're seeing with the Charlie XCX piece, then you have a whole swath of young voters who now start paying attention. And that's an endorsement in and of itself from a very different kind of part of the world that could really benefit Kamala Harris in just generating enthusiasm. Again, I want to give some credit to young generations of voters, especially Gen Z voters are critical and they're thoughtful and they're engaged. They're some of the most active in politics outside of kind of voting, right? Like, they've been protesting for a long time. Mm-hmm. So they're not going to just accept that and vote for Kamala Harris because a famous singer, tweeted. But they may pay more attention, right? They may start to say, like, well, maybe I should give her a second look. And I think that's where that's an upsell for a younger candidate, a more diverse candidate. And absolutely, in this case, I think it also is related to being a woman candidate. Absolutely.
Some of the attacks she's already seen, in my opinion, feel very gendered and racialized. We've seen some critiques about how she laughs, and we've also seen some critiques that she is just a stepmom and has not given birth herself. What have you made of the early attacks against Vice President Harris?
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely, again, a lot of these attacks have been filtering not only through the internet, but through the RNC and through the Trump campaign for, like I said, many years. And so attacks on the laugh, right? This is something Donald Trump has attacked women's looks and voices historically. That's a trope, right? It is saying, like, we don't want to listen to women. They're so jarring. And it's a contrast to what is actually like the power of women's voices, right? And so if you critique the actual tenor of the voice instead of the substance, right, you try to diminish the seriousness of that candidate. So I think we're definitely seeing that in a sort of gendered way that is been used. It was used against Clinton. It will be used against many other women in powerful positions to say, I just can't listen to that voice, right? And so the laugh is part of that. We've seen attacks on her qualifications. That's playing absolutely into perceptions. We know that people assume credentials for men. They assume white men are particularly qualified for any position of leadership because they've seen them in those positions of leadership. They tend to question and seek out credentials for women and question whether or not they actually have the skills and expertise necessary for the job. So if you are somebody running against a woman, you're going to start to try to put holes in those credentials. You're going to use sexualized tropes like she slept her way to the top. We're seeing that happen to Kamala Harris. This is not new. But so what that means for the campaign and her advocates is they're going to have to talk more about her credentials to push back. She has plenty, so it shouldn't be that hard, but that's absolutely a tactic. And then you mentioned, the motherhood piece, and I would add to that in terms of race, folks saying she's not Black enough, she's not mom enough, right? And so this piece on identity is really complex in that we have purity standards sometimes for these identities. And she's going to push against them She's multiracial, right? And so to the extent that she has already and will continue to push back against these purity kind of standards for any identity, I also think there are big swaths of the population who will actually relate to that, right? There are a lot of stepmothers or bonus moms who are going like, wait a second, hold on, right? And maybe I can identify with her in a unique way. Or multiracial populations, which are absolutely growing across the United States. So I think you absolutely think she's going to face, but at the same point, there are ways for her to leverage these identities and these questions as well into discussion and advantages. Maybe not her directly. I think she'll probably try to stick to the campaign issues, but certainly those who are around her and who will speak on her behalf and advocate for her.
I just want to end on the issues because we've talked about reproductive rights. We've talked about the war in Gaza. We've talked about immigration a little bit. Obviously, inflation is a concern for so many consumers and Americans and really people around the world. If you were Kamala Harris, what would you make your issue focus? I know you said she won't deviate from the campaign too much. She's been on the ticket. We're so close to the general, so you implied she won't reinvent the wheel, but will she become the inflation candidate? Will she become the abortion candidate? If you had to make a guess, what do you think she'll do?
Yeah. Look, I think if you look at the polls and you look at what people care about, it's always economy first. But I think the message is going to be less about kind of the global economy or even inflation, more to, can you afford to pay your bills? Can you afford to feed your family? Do you have a job? Are student loans killing you? Right? All of those, what we would sometimes talk about as kind of kitchen table economic issues, well-being issues, I think she'll lean in on, as Democrats will across the country, to say, hey, we've made gains and we've made it better, and we're going to continue to do this work. I think that finish the job argument that Biden had been putting out will be part of what she's saying when it comes to the economy, right? We've recovered, but we have more work to do. That'll be top of mind. And absolutely, I think she'll also talk about the fragility of our democracy. You know, when she's prosecuting the case, because she will use this language against Donald Trump, she's going to talk about his actual criminal violations, right? His overt attempts to undermine democracy when it comes to voting, when it comes to January 6th, the way he's talked about these issues. So I think preserving democracy, when you look at any polls, is a big concern, especially to Democratic voters, and you're going to see her speak to that. And then I think the issue of abortion, because it's mobilizing, not because it's the top issue, but it is a mobilizing issue. It is exemplary of attacks on rights. That she will probably also continue to put in the forefront of attacks on the other side, on the other candidate and his party.
Kelly Dittmar, thank you so much for coming on and explaining all of this. We so appreciate your time, and we hope to have you back as the campaign continues to unfold.
Thank you.